Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of The Agenda by the Indian Youth Economic Association. This guest lecture is also part of our mentorship program for 2020. And today we will be discussing the integration and accession of princely states into the Union of India after independence. We have with us not only an extremely esteemed and well-known personality, a very dear mentor to our organization who has been guiding us through the years. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Deepak Verma, former CEO of IYEA Life Insurance and President of the Debating Society of India. Mr. Verma takes a key interest in promoting debating and other youth-based activities and has been mentor not just to the Indian Youth Economic Association, but to various debating teams, and including those at Ashoka University and across Delhi University. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. It is indeed a privilege and an honor for us to host you. Today's session will be focused on history, which is one of our key themes in which we promote research and mentorship. And the specific point that Mr. Verma will be dealing with today is the integration and accession post the independence in the initial years right after independence. So welcome, sir. We'll shift to your screen. Very warm welcome.
Thank you, Ajay. And I'm delighted to be speaking with all of you this afternoon. I think it would be useful for me to start by very explaining, for the benefit of those who are slightly confused or perhaps fuzzy, about the difference between accession and integration. Accession is the act by a political unit, a sovereign unit, of voluntarily agreeing to be part of a federation. In this case, it was a federation of states with the provinces of India to constitute the Union of India. It may or may not have implied a limitation on the level of autonomy enjoyed. Accession is different from integration in as much integration is a much more fundamental issue. Integration implies the agreement of that political entity, the sovereign entity, to merge itself into a federation, in the process extinguishing its political identity and voluntarily yielding its autonomy to that federation. So there is a substantial difference. Let me also acknowledge at the very beginning the sources that I have, if I might add, somewhat industriously consulted in putting this talk together. The first and foremost is V.P. Menon's book, The Integration of the Princely States of India. V.P. Menon was the Secretary of the States Department of India, which was part of the Home Ministry, headed by Vallabhbhai Patel at the time of partition. And Menon is the man, more than anyone else, who actually oversaw every single aspect of this accession and integration. His book is the most definitive work on the subject. It was written in 1956. My second source is the work done by Professor Ian Copland, an Australian professor who has devoted a substantial part of his life to studying the lives of the Indian princes, particularly leading up to partition. Copland's book is very interesting because, unlike Menon's book, which is nationalist and therefore partisan, Copland represents very accurately the point of view of the princes and also reflects over his book British politics, which very often, as you will observe, held hostage the fortunes of the Indian princes in India. The third source is Ramchandra Guha's magnificent India After Partition. Although Ramchandra has not devoted a substantial amount of effort, or substantial amount of pages to this, right? Whatever he has said about it has been truly magnificent because he has reflected the essentials of that period. And finally, Wikipedia, which I have discovered, much to my delight, has been a repository of rich and varied information on the subject. Now, the organization of my talk will cover 4 steps. To start with, I will trace the evolution of the history of the relationship between the British Crown and the princely states of India as they spanned from 1800 to 1947. It is vitally important to understand the evolution of this relationship because it has significant impact on accession and integration. I will then talk about the actual accession, move on to integration, during the course of which I will also talk about briefly the intervention by Mrs. Gandhi. And then at the end, I will raise certain ethical and legal issues, which I think are embedded in this entire chapter of history, and which I think will be of interest to scholars. Now, let me start first by showing you a map of India as it existed in 1947. Ajay, could we have the map, please? All right. So you see before you India as in 1947. Now, the first point I want to make is that although the British had suzerainty over the entire Indian unit, there were actually 2 Indias. There was first British India, which consisted of a number of provinces that the British administered directly. Each province was run by a governor, and under the governor, there was an administrative structure. This talk has nothing to do with British India, except insofar as the fates of British India and the princely states are tied up. The second part of India was the princely states. These princely states together constituted 40% of the territory of India and 25% of the population lived in the princely states. The darkened portions are the princely states. Now, there's an optical illusion here. It appears that the princely states are just lumped together across India, but actually embedded in these dark shaded areas is a mosaic of hundreds of princely states. To be precise, 565 of them, right? And these princely states varied very, very large, very greatly in size and context. At the very top were 2 huge states, Hyderabad and Jammu and Kashmir, 80,000 square miles, both the size of European countries. They had currency, they had railways, they had defense, they had a variety of institutions, and they pretty much ran their own show. There were roughly 140 large states, of which these 2 were at the very top. At the bottom, there were over 300 tiny states. Tiny is really tiny. Averages are deceptive, but essentially, these 325 states on the average had an average size of 20 square miles, an average population of barely 3,000, and very small annual revenues, very small annual revenues. Some of these states traced their descent from ancient India. Some of them actually traced their descent from the warriors of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Some of them had come to existence during the course of the British Empire. Hyderabad, for example, had come into existence as a vassal state of the Mughal Empire. Now, these states also varied greatly in the quality of their governance. Some of the states were extremely well run. They had representative institutions. They had educated populations. Baroda, Bikaner, Travancore, Hyderabad all had institutions. Many of them were endowed with fine universities, palaces, museums, and as I said, they had representative institutions. At the other end, at a polarity, many of the small states were complete despotisms. In fact, it was almost as if the rulers in these little states had entered into a Faustian bargain They had sold their souls to the British devil, and in return for the protection that the British offered them, they had the opportunity to practice unrestricted despotism in their little territories. And their subjects lived almost in a Hobbesian state of nature, where life was nasty, brutish, and often short. By and large, the princes unfortunately got bad press. Nehru considered the princely states to be fickle and dissolute. And in the early 1800s, many of the British governor generals and later viceroys also considered them to be sinks of incompetence. I think this is an unfair generalization. As I have mentioned, there were many princely states which had excellent standards of governance, which were actually quite comparable to those of constitutional monarchies in the West. The British had organized all these princely states in an order of precedence, in an order of rank. And the mechanism used was the principle of gun salutes. So the larger states, 120 states, were recognized by being given a certain number of salutes. And these salutes were gun salutes fired on ceremonial occasions. These salutes moved in an order of 2. So at the very top, there were 5 states which had 21 gun salutes. These were Hyderabad, Jammu and Kashmir, Baroda, Mysore, and Gwalior. And then they came down progressively. Right. This is very important because it gave the British a basis to decide on how they should actually interact with a particular state. And it satisfied the needs of the princes, the need of the princes for recognition of their relative importance, given all the pageantry and pomp that they were so used to. Anyway, be whatever it is, the fact is that the existence of these states in 1947 was a consequence of the relationship that they had developed over the British with the British Crown over the last 150 years. Now, this relationship I broadly divide into 2 epochs. There was the epoch which started in approximately 1800 and lasted till 1900. And I call this the epoch of imperial conquest and expansion. This was followed, starting very early in 1900 and extending till 1947, by the epoch which I call the era of alliance. This was an era in which the nature of the relationship between the princely states and the British Crown moved from ruler and vassal to partners, admittedly a stronger partner or a dominant partner, but still a more relational one. Let's now start with the canvas as it existed in 1800. I start with Lord Wellesley. Lord Wellesley, the beginning of 1800, was the arch-imperialist. He established the system of subsidiary alliances under which states had to accept treaties with the British Crown. The treaties required them to agree not to maintain their own forces, not to wage war, not to engage in any conversations or treaties with other states, and to maintain within their boundaries a force of British troops to pay for it, right? The idea was that the British had captive troops, and these troops were vested with the responsibility of also providing protection to the states if they were becoming the victims of external harassment or external warfare. Wellesley established alliances with Travancore, Mysore, Hyderabad, Gwalior, and Baroda. Right. After Wellesley, we had Lord Hastings. Now, Lord Hastings is important in the context of this talk, only in as much as he was the first to enunciate the principle of paramountcy. The principle of paramountcy basically is the principle which was the overriding factor in the relationship between the crown and the princely states right till the time of independence. Essentially, what paramountcy said was, and it was defined actually by Lord Reading only in the 1900s in a very precise manner. It said, the sovereignty of the British Crown is supreme in India and therefore no ruler of an Indian state can justifiably claim to negotiate with the British government on an equal footing. I quote, "It is the right and duty of the British government to preserve peace and order throughout India. The varying degrees of internal sovereignty which the rulers enjoy are all subject to the due exercise by the paramount power of this responsibility." So there it was, that we are dominant and you have autonomy, but your autonomy is subject to our intervention. Anyway, next we had Lord Dalhousie, another aggressive imperialist, but this time with imperialism cloaked in a certain amount of subterfuge. He defined the infamous Doctrine of Lapse, under which the British took upon themselves the right to depose the ruler of any native state who did not have a natural heir or who, in their opinion, misgoverned. This was ruthlessly exercised over the course of his governor-generalship. Dalhousie annexed 30 states. He also pushed the frontiers of India. He annexed the Punjab and he pushed the frontiers of India to its natural boundary, which was the frontiers which was the foothills of Afghanistan. Right. This policy of annexation alienated many of the princes, and it was one of the contributing factors which led to the Great Indian Mutiny of 1857, or if you choose to view differently, the first war, put it off please, the first war of independence. For a while, that was touch and go. Ultimately, the British survived. Reprisals were bloody and they were violent. But Lord Canning, who was then the Governor General, realized that the princes of India had stood firmly on the side of the British government, firmly on the side of the British crown during this mutiny, either by not participating or in some cases by actually assisting the British to suppress this. This was recognized, and Lord Canning thought it should now become, this recognition should now become a fundamental part of British policy. So he did two things. One is, in the Royal Proclamation, the Act of 1858 of Good Governance, he asked that the Queen insert a clause in which she said that henceforth the British Crown would respect the rights and privilege of the rulers, and he also eliminated the Doctrine of Lapse. It looked like this was the chapter of a new relationship between the princes and the Crown of India. Alas, this was not to be. By the 1870s, the fickle British mind had forgotten the sacrifices made by the princes, the contribution made by the princes, and once again, an aggressive policy was adopted. This time, the policy was not of conquest, because India had largely been conquered, but it was the policy of continuous intervention. The British chipped away at the autonomy of individual states. Railways were taken over, posts and telegraphs taken over, customs duties and unions were subtracted. A whole variety of actions were taken, which reduced the internal autonomy of the states. At the same time, the British reaffirmed, and as apologists will often point out, their commitment to a civilizing mission, and they defined it in terms of putting pressure on rulers to offer, as they said, better governance to their subjects. The Lord Mayo, the founder of my erstwhile school, famously told a collection of princes in Rajputana, if you want our protection, you must offer good governance. The apogee of this form of aggressive paternalism came in the time of Lord Curzon, who deposed as many as 63 rulers and exercised extreme authority over the princes. In fact, some of the princes in their memoirs have even mentioned that the sheer memory of the Curzon era was enough to drive them to tears. Let's now move to 1900. Now, while the late 80s saw aggressive British intervention in the affairs of India, there was a change developing over the late 80s in the mindsets of the British public and British politicians. The change was that the British had started to understand the culture and the history of India. Earlier perceptions of India had been formed by soldiers and interventionists who had tended to project the darker sides of Indian society and a very, very imperfect understanding of India's rich traditions and heritage had developed. That was changing. The British started realizing that India was a hierarchical society, that Indians responded well to hierarchy. They responded to traditional sources of authority like landlords and bureaucrats, and most of all to their princes. And therefore, it made sense for the British to say that let us not intervene, let us ally with the princes, and let the princes rule over their subjects. The other contributing factor to this change in perception was the fact that a number of princes, now Western educated, good speakers of English, had moved out and were dazzling British society. Ranjit Singh Ji and Pataudi were dazzling English crowds with the quality of their cricket. British aristocracy was visiting India and was shooting sand grouse in Bikaner and tigers in the jungles of Alwar. Viceroys and their wives were visiting palaces of Indian princes and were dazzled by the magnificence and the opulence. So started the change in perception, and this was defined in a doctrine of laissez-faire, a hands-off doctrine where the British Crown and the Viceroy said that let the princes rule, they are our natural allies. This was enunciated in 1905 by Lord Minto in a conference in Udaipur. And it eventually culminated in 1921 with the establishment of a chamber of princes. The princes had long felt the need for a body to represent their interests to the British. And they were also aware that the Congress, nationalism was on the rise, and there were changes being contemplated to the fabric of India. Unfortunately, the discussions on those changes were taking place between the Congress and the British Crown and the British government. The princes were not part of it. So the creation of the Chamber of Princes was an attempt to give the princes also a voice in the future of India. This was launched in a glittering ceremony in February 1921 in New Delhi. And the high point of this was a proclamation read out by George V at that gathering, where once again the British Crown reaffirmed its pledge to support and honor the privileges and the dignity of the princes. Unfortunately, going forward, the Chamber of Princes never really took off effectively as a body. Part of the reason was that the larger princes never joined. Hyderabad, ever conscious of its position as numero uno in the pecking order of the hierarchy of Indian princes, did not join. Neither did Mysore, Travancore. So it was never very effective. Attendance was low. Out of 120 people, barely 30 attended the first session, and after that, average attendance was only 45. Anyway, moving forward, towards the end of the 20s, new strands appeared on the table. The strands were that, first of all, there were extreme movements of nationalism. The second was that the issue of federation surfaced. The princes realized that perhaps the most enduring way of getting their security and safety in India was to enter into a federation. And so the Chamber of Princes quickly accepted an invitation from the Viceroy to attend the roundtable conferences, which were held in London in 30, 31, and 32, in order to discuss progress for India towards self-rule. As a result of this participation and the prince's assent to participate, or the prince's broad assent, I put it that way, to participate in the Federation, the Government of India Act was promulgated in 1935. The act was not very well received by the provinces because although it widened franchise, the government of Great Britain retained most of the financial authorities and authority over defense and foreign affairs. So it really did not give India the dominion status we're looking for. But the deal for the princes was very, very sweet. First and foremost, although the princes represented only 25% of the population of the country, they were offered 40% of the seats in the legislature, in the upper house. And they were offered 33% of the seats in the lower house. So representation disproportionate to the weightage and population. Secondly, the princes were given the privilege of being able to select and nominate their representatives to the assemblies rather than have them elected. If they had been forced to nominate or forced to send representatives who were elected, it stood to reason that Congress nominees would have won and the loyalty of these nominees would have been compromised. So this was a big, big win for the princes. The third was that it was expressly provided in the legislation that the provinces could not interfere or involve themselves in any meaningful way in the internal affairs of the princely states. And lastly, it was provided that the federation would become a reality only if at least half the princely states, half the large princely states acceded. This act was passed. Lord Linlithgow then returned to India. He came in as a viceroy in 36, 37 and spent 3 years trying to canvass support from the princes for the federation. Unfortunately, by this time, support for the federation had waned. Unfortunately, the princes changed their mind. Why did they change their mind? I think part of the reason was that they were worried about losing their financial authorities. Partly, the smaller princely states felt that their interests would not be adequately protected, and the princes were also becoming increasingly worried about the growing influence of Congress and of the possibility going forward that in gerrymandered constituencies, the Congress would actually emerge as a dominant force and suppress the aspirations of the princes. The act failed. To my mind, this was a tremendous, tremendous loss for the princes and for the British. Why did the British lose? The British lost because this was an opportunity for the British to underwrite their dominance of India for at least another generation. The princes, if they had federated, would have acted as a counterweight to the aspirations of the Congress party and would have supported the British. And the Congress itself, because the Muslim League was participating, would have been checkmated by the Muslim League. Unfortunately for the British, this did not happen. The princes lost because this, as events proved later, was the only chance they had of entering a federation where their autonomy would be preserved, where their sovereignty, where their internal rights would have been adequately protected. And the Congress lost because if this federation had worked, it is possible that partition would never have happened. Anyway, along came the war. As usual, the princes excelled themselves in war. They provided men, materials, and machines to the British. 500,000 men from the princely states enlisted. Jammu and Kashmir gave 18 ambulances. Hyderabad produced 3 squadrons of fighter planes. Travancore built a patrol boat. This contribution was recognized by the British. Churchill and Wavell were laudatory in their appreciation of the threat, and it was now very clear on the cards that India would soon achieve dominance. Would soon achieve dominion status. After the war, Attlee announced in 1945 that India would achieve dominion status. In 1946, the cabinet mission came to India. The job of the cabinet mission was to establish machinery, a constituent assembly for making a constitution of India. And the cabinet mission announced that the transfer of power to India would take place immediately after the Constitution of India was framed. There was nothing very much in the cabinet mission for the princes themselves, because most of it was directed for the provinces. But what was said and what was reassuring was that the princes would not be compelled to accede to either, the sovereignty of the princes would not be transferred to any of the 2 domains. And if the princes so wish, they could join either domain, or they could make particular arrangements of their own. In 1947, in February, Attlee announced that the transfer of power to India would take place latest by June 1948. And in in 1947, late 1947, Mountbatten came to India. Meanwhile, an interim government at the end of 1946 had been set up in India and a constituent assembly formed. Fortunately, some of the princes had agreed to join the constituent assembly because they wanted to be part of constitution making. It obviously made sense for them to influence the direction that the constitution would take, rather than to find themselves confronted in a federation with a constitution that they had not influenced the formation thereof. So that made a lot of sense. Anyway, Mountbatten announced that there will be a transfer of power. It will take place on the 15th of August, 1947. The princes will have the right to either accede to India or to Pakistan. So the paramountcy which the British enjoyed over the princes will not be transferred to the succeeding dominion. So the princes, in that sense, were assured of their sovereignty. The princes were also told that if you do not wish to accede to either India or Pakistan, you may become independent. This is the situation which then existed in June. Enter VP Menon. VP Menon was a diminutive, ferociously intelligent member of the Indian Civil Service. The States Department was formed between June and July under Sardar Patel. Menon, when he looked at the situation, he realized that there were barely 2.5 months to go for the actual transfer of power. And he was confronted with the awful prospect of having, within the space of 2.5 months, to ensure the accession, ideally, of all 565 states to the Indian Union. If this did not happen, then the prospect of administrative chaos loomed large. This is because in many parts of India, many public services traverse the territories of both the princes as well as the provinces. For example, thousands of miles of railway were dotted across the princely states. If the princely states became sovereign in August because they had not acceded to India, you would have had the amazing prospect of having Indian railways travel through 567 states, 565 of them being the princely states and the other 2 being India and Pakistan. This was absolutely absurd. The same situation for the postal telegraph, same situation for communication, for a whole variety of other issues. The other problem was that in many cases, treaties of common concern between the people of India, the provinces of India, and the princely states had been executed. And the British had also expressed their intention of repudiating all treaties by the 15th of August. If these treaties were repudiated, many public services which originated in the princely states would no longer be available. So Menon first drew up an urgent plan of accession. The plan was very simple. The plan said, we will persuade the princes to accede on only 3 subjects: defense, foreign affairs, and communications. Now, defense and foreign affairs in any case was not under the control of the princes. So in acceding on these 2, they were giving up nothing. It also made logical sense for them to accede on communications because they realized that communications were national, right? So the instrument of accession seemed to make a lot of sense. The next step that Menon took was that along with Sardar Patel, he went to Lord Mountbatten and he requested Lord Mountbatten's help to persuade the princely states to accede to India. This is where Lord Mountbatten made the most significant and the most enduring contribution ever made by a viceroy to India. Lord Mountbatten considered the matter and said yes, and then jumped in on the side of the Indian princes. I beg your pardon, on the side of the Indian Union. Right. Now, the draft instruments of accession having been prepared, the next step was to sell these instruments of accession to the princes. Patel and Menon, in a series of meetings, met friendly princes and were able to bring a large number of them on the side. But the most important contribution, as I said, was made by Lord Mountbatten. On the 25th of July, he addressed a meeting of the Chamber of Princes where he addressed a meeting of the Chamber of Princes in which he told them that they had the option to either join India or Pakistan or be independent, but it made no sense for them to be independent because they could not really manage their own affairs. He then said, although they had the option to join either India or Pakistan, it made sense for them to accede to the dominion that was close geographically contiguous to them. He said it makes sense for them to accede on the subject of defense because by and large, they were not in a position to handle aggression from a larger neighbor. Again, he said it made sense for them to yield on foreign affairs because they either had the experience, nor would they want to wish to go to the trouble of actually setting up an entire network of embassies abroad. Be that as it may, the princes were greatly impressed, and there is no doubt about the fact that Mountbatten's speech persuaded many of them to sign up to accede to the Union of India. This process went on. Most signed. Some of the princes gave trouble. Holkar of Indore was troubled. Nabha, Dholpur, Bilaspur, and Bharatpur signed a little late, but they eventually signed. 6 princely states, large ones, created trouble. Travancore, which had always from the very beginning said that it would not be part of a Federation of India, right, did not accept this proposition. In fact, Travancore had reached out independently to conservatives in the UK and had been encouraged in its ambitions to do so. They were represented by a very, very prominent Diwan, C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, who Menon tried to persuade but was unsuccessful. At any rate, Menon, after discussions with Mountbatten, Iyer, after discussions with Mountbatten and Menon, went back. On his way back, he was a victim of an assassination attempt, by a nationalist who was keen that Travancore Cochin join. As a consequence of this, he was shaken and he advised the Maharaja to accede, and the Maharaja did. Bhopal was grief-stricken at the decision to create a federation. He was deeply sympathetic to Pakistan, had a very, very strong relationship with Jinnah, and he saw the decision to create a federation as the British letting down the Muslims of India. He was an old friend of Mountbatten's. He appealed to Mountbatten. He said he would not like to succeed. He wanted to be independent. Mountbatten talked with him and at length was able to persuade him to sign up, and he joined India. It is to his credit that once he agreed to accede to India, he built an excellent relationship with Patel. The third was Jodhpur. Jodhpur was a strange case. The Maharaja ran a state where the population was overwhelmingly Hindu, but he actually seriously considered acceding to Pakistan. It appears that Jinnah gave him a blank sheet of paper and told him to write down his own set conditions. And he actually came very close to it. He only changed his mind and decided to accede to India when his friend Jaisalmer pointed out to him that, sir, if there was a riot in your state between Hindus and Muslims, who would you join? It was obvious that he could not support the Muslims. His nobility, right, was in favor of joining India, and this is what he did. This left Junagadh, Hyderabad.
Yes, sir. I think that angle is better.
Yeah.
Because
yes, am I better now?
Yes, sir. This is all right. This angle.
So that left Junagadh, Hyderabad, and Kashmir. Junagadh was ruled by a Muslim Maharaja, but again had an overwhelmingly Hindu population. His Diwan persuaded him to accede to Pakistan. So he sent an accession. He actually sent a formal accession to Pakistan. Pakistan sat on it for several weeks, and then Jinnah finally accepted it. Patel was mortified when he heard about this. So the first thing that he did was he got two tributary states of Junagadh, Hindu states. He got the Maharajas of these two states to agree to accede to India. Then an agitation was launched, or government in exile, by a political party which mobilized the people of Junagadh to say that they wanted to join India. Anyway, be that as it may, what eventually happened was that Patel sent in troops to Junagadh. There was local trouble, there was insurrection. The Maharaja, realizing that an accession to Pakistan was not possible, fled to Karachi, and Junagadh acceded. Hyderabad was the most controversial, the most difficult. The situation in Hyderabad was that from the very beginning, the Nizam, who was one of the richest men in the world and also one of the most miserly, had said that he would never accede to either India or to Pakistan. He would be independent. In order to do this, he had actually hired the services of a very, very expensive British barrister, who was also a die-hard conservative, to represent his case to the British Crown. And he built friends among the conservatives in Britain. Now, the situation on the ground in Hyderabad was complicated by the fact that there were three players. There was the Congress, there was a party of Muslims, the Ittihad al-Muslimat, and under this party, right, there was a militant wing called the Razakars, led by Qasim Razikar, which was militant, a very militant organization, and there were communists. Anyway, the Congress agitated for an accession to India. The Ittihad Muslims agitated for independence. The communists around the Telangana district agitated for the abolition and the decimation of landlords. And for many, many months after partition was actually declared, there was chaos and insurrection in Hyderabad. Well, to cut a long story short, after Mountbatten had resigned and left, and just after the death of Jinnah in 1948, right, Patel said, enough is enough. And the Indian army was sent in to Hyderabad. The Indian army was sent in to liberate Hyderabad, as they put it that way. There was conflict. There was conflict between the Razakars and the Indian army. In that conflict, 40 Indian soldiers were died. It is claimed that several thousand Razakars died, but the consequence of that was that Hyderabad acceded to India. You know the situation in Kashmir. I will not belabor the situation in Kashmir, other than to say that the Maharaja also prevaricated. Pakistan in 1947 sent in tribals from the northwest area. The ruler Hari Singh was agitated, and in late 1947, he asked the Indian government for help. The Indian government agreed to help, but in return for that, asked him to accede to India, which he did. This completed it. Instruments of accession were then signed. Now, there were three instruments of accession. There was one, which was a comprehensive one, which had to be applied to the large states. I've already described what it was. This was signed without too much fuss. Insofar as the 300 small states were concerned, the instrument of accession was a very, very simple one. These states had historically, in any case, enjoyed very, very little autonomy. They'd been administered largely by the political officers of the British Crown. So the instruments of accession that were signed with these simply kept them at the same status. The government of India took over the authorities of the political agents and the British Crown. And in the case of the intermediate states, about 140 of them, the instruments of accession that was signed reverted these states to the situation that they were in when the political agents, before the political agents were actually administering them. So that completed the process. Right. This is where the matter rested. Accession was complete. Now, it is at this stage that Patel and Menon turned towards integration. Now, it is not known the literature is not clear about whether Mountbatten was taken into confidence about this at an earlier stage. It is also not known whether Patel and Menon had always contemplated integration, although it is likely that they had. At any rate, there was trouble in Orissa at the end of 1947. There was a tribal uprising. So the small states of Orissa were called in, right? And they were asked to sign an instrument of integration into India. And well, it was called an instrument of accession. And they were merged within the existing Orissa state. This then set the stage for the actual integration of these princely states, of these erstwhile princely states, into India. Now, this was a threefold process. In the first instance, we had to deal with the question of the 325 small states. This was dealt with very simply by getting these small states, tiny, tiny states, merged into the provinces, right? Some of them, most of them were merged into provinces, and some of them were merged into what were called chief commissioners' provinces. And the Government of India Act of 1935, along with certain amendments that had to be carried out, was extended to cover these states. So they effectively became fully integrated into India. The bigger challenge was the integration of the 140 larger states. Now, this was done by a very, very interesting process. Essentially, what the government did, and what Menon did, was to create a situation where these princely states were merged into larger units called princely unions, and 5 such unions were created. 5 such unions were created. Every time a union was created, and I beg your pardon, an instrument of accession was signed, another instrument of accession. The instrument of accession, once again, acceded to the Indian Union. The first instrument of accession, when the first set of unions took place, acceded only on the same 3 issues, which were defense, foreign affairs, and communications. But when subsequent unions were formed, the scope of the instruments of accession were extended to eventually include all the subjects on the concurrent and union lists. Finally, all these unions, these 5 princely unions, each of them were placed under the leadership of a Raj Pramukh. The Raj Pramukh was invariably the former prince of one of the largest states of each of these unions. After the instruments of accession were signed, the Raj Pramukhs got together, and at one more conference, the Raj Pramukhs of all the princely unions formally accepted the integration of the states of all these princely unions into the Union of India, and ensured that legislative authority across the entire range of subjects was handed over to them. The question now was how do you take over the executive arm of the states? The legislative arm had been taken over, but how would you exercise authority over the functioning of ministers? This was done very simply by an act, by the acceptance by the Raj Pramukhs of the fact that they would act under the orders of the Union of India, under the orders of the President of India. So control over the Council of Ministers was now vested under the Raj Pramukhs, and the Raj Pramukhs in turn were under the control of the Government of India. Now, finally, each of these princely unions was to have its own constitution. That was the earlier thinking. What the government actually did was that it shared with these princely unions, right, a draft of the Constitution of India that was actually under development in the Constituent Assembly. It gave those princely unions an opportunity to review that draft, and once those drafts were reviewed, some of the princely unions made suggestions for modifications. These were accepted, but in the end, all the princely unions accepted the Constitution of India. Sardar had very wisely told them, those of them who had not yet had legislatures, that If you have not had the chance to discuss the Constitution of India in your legislature because your legislature has not been formed, I promise that when your first legislature will be formed, you will have a chance to discuss the Constitution, and we will make modifications if they are acceptable. So this is how administrative, legislative, and constitutionalization of the states was achieved. In 1950, the Constitution was declared. The states of India were classified into four. Part A had the 9 provinces, which we have nothing to do with. Part B had the 5 unions and the 3 large states of Jammu and Kashmir, Hyderabad, and Mysore. Part C had the areas under Chief Commissioner's provinces, and Part D had the area of Andaman and Nicobar. Now, the position of the Part A and the Part B states was practically identical, right? The only difference was that by a special promulgation, the Constitution said that Part B states, which were essentially the princely unions, would, for a period of 10 years after the start of the Constitution, be under the superintendence and follow the instructions of the President of India. In that way, it was ensured that the President would have control over the governance of the Part B states, that they could not, right, in any way deviate from their adherence to the Constitution of India. This now led us to the question of the privy purses. There was a quid pro quo involved, obviously. The princes had given up autonomy, right? They had agreed to let them submerge, and they needed to be satisfied. So VP Menon devised the privy purses. These were based on the salute ranking of the states, the revenues of the states, and the sort of overall provenance of the dynasties. Essentially, what the privy purses worked out were as follows. The princes were given a tax-free allowance, which by my calculations, roughly worked out to between 8 and 9% of 8 to 9% of the revenues of the state. Earlier, by earlier calculations, the princes had been taking, based on the sliding scale, between 10 and 30% of the revenues of the state for themselves. His formula pegged the number at an average of about, as I said, between 8 and 9%. Now, the award of the privy purses was fairly uniform. Except for the top 11 states, it was fairly uniform. The top 11 states got a special the rulers of the top 11 former states got a special deal. I have the numbers here. They're quite interesting. I'm going to give you the numbers in lakhs, and then I'm going to tell you that I actually, out of interest, I actually compounded these 1950 numbers and brought them up to what their value would be in 2020. And I used a figure of 5%, assumed a 5% inflation rate. The Nizam of Hyderabad